There is a place in the United States where silence is enforced, not requested. A place where men are allowed outside their cells for less than 1 hour a day, alone, inside concrete cages with no roof, no view, and no human contact. No conversations, no handshakes, no faces. This is not a secret military site. This is not a black ops facility. This place exists openly, legally, and permanently. It is called Pelican Bay State Prison. And inside it is one outdoor yard that became one of the most tightly controlled spaces in the entire United States correctional system. Not because of riots, not because of escapes, but because prison officials believed that even a few seconds of human contact could trigger violence powerful enough to spread across the entire California prison system. For decades, this yard was designed so that no two prisoners could ever touch, speak, or even see each other clearly. Men were kept here for 10, 15, sometimes more than 20 years, without committing a single violent act inside the unit. How did one prison yard become a symbol of absolute control? And what happens to the human mind when isolation becomes policy, not punishment? This is not a story of one crime. This is the story of a system. Pelican Bay State Prison was not built by accident. It was built out of fear. In the late 1980s, California's prison system was facing a crisis. Violence inside state prisons was escalating, driven largely by powerful prison gangs that operated not only behind bars, but across entire regions of the state. These gangs communicated through coded messages, brief encounters in exercise yards, and even momentary contact during transfers. Prison officials believed that traditional maximum security prisons were no longer enough. They wanted a facility designed not to rehabilitate, but to control. Pelican Bay State Prison opened in 1989 near the Oregon border in one of the most remote locations in California. The isolation was intentional. Cold weather, constant fog, and distance from major cities made escape unlikely and oversight limited. From the beginning, Pelican Bay was different. At the center of the prison was the Security Housing Unit, known as the SHU. This unit was designed to hold inmates considered the most dangerous, disruptive, or influential within the prison system. Many were not placed there for violent acts committed at Pelican Bay. Instead, they were sent to the SHU based on intelligence reports, suspected gang affiliation, or alleged influence over other inmates. Inside the SHU, isolation was the foundation of control. Cells were constructed entirely of concrete and steel. Windows did not face the outside world. Natural light was minimal or non-existent. But the most extreme feature was the exercise yard. Unlike traditional prison yards, Pelican Bay's SHU yard was divided into small, individual enclosures. Each inmate was taken alone into a concrete pen, surrounded by high walls and fencing. No shared space, no group recreation, no communication. Prison officials believed that if inmates were never allowed to interact, gang structures would collapse. Orders could not be passed. Violence could not be coordinated. The yard became a weapon of prevention. Every movement was scheduled. Every door was remotely controlled. Every interaction was eliminated. For prison administrators, this was not cruelty. It was strategy. They argued that Pelican Bay prevented bloodshed not just within its walls, but throughout the entire California prison system. By isolating influential inmates, they believed they were saving lives elsewhere. But this approach came at a cost. Inmates in the SHU spent between 22 and 24 hours a day alone in their cells. Exercise was limited. Human contact was nearly non-existent. Some prisoners remained under these conditions for years, others for decades. And while violence inside the SHU was rare, The psychological effects of long-term isolation began to raise serious questions. Questions that would eventually reach the courts, the media, and the public. For the men housed in Pelican Bay's security housing unit, daily life followed a strict and unchanging routine. Each cell measured approximately 8 by 10 feet. The walls were solid concrete. The doors were steel, perforated with small holes to allow guards to observe inside. Inside the cell, there was a bed fixed to the floor, a stainless steel sink, and a toilet. Meals were delivered through a narrow slot at the door. In most cases, inmates ate alone, every day, in silence. When it was time for exercise, the process was precise and controlled. An inmate was handcuffed through the cell door, escorted by guards, and led down a corridor to the exercise yard. The yard was not grass. It was not open space. It was a concrete enclosure, often described by former inmates as a dog run. High walls blocked the horizon. Chain-link fencing covered the open top. From inside, the sky was visible, but only in fragments. Each yard was designed for one person. No contact with other inmates was allowed. No conversation, no eye contact. For prison officials, this design reduced risk to nearly zero. But for inmates, the effects accumulated slowly. Mental health professionals and legal observers documented symptoms that became common inside the SHU. Anxiety, depression, paranoia, memory loss, and difficulty concentrating. Some inmates reported hearing voices. Others experienced severe panic attacks during or after isolation. These effects were not isolated cases. Multiple studies and court filings later confirmed that prolonged solitary confinement could cause long-lasting psychological damage, especially when lasting years or decades. Yet placement in the SHU often had no fixed end date. Inmates were told they could be released from isolation if they debriefed, meaning they provided information about gang activity. For many, this was seen as dangerous or impossible. Refusing to debrief often meant remaining in the SHU indefinitely. As a result, some prisoners spent more than 20 years in near-total isolation without a single disciplinary violation inside the unit. Despite the extreme conditions, physical violence inside the SHU yard was rare. But that absence of violence came with an invisible cost. By removing all human interaction, the yard did not simply prevent conflict, it altered behavior, perception, and identity. Former inmates later described losing the ability to hold conversations. Others said they struggled to make eye contact after release. The yard, designed as a security measure, had become a psychological experiment conducted in silence, and outside the prison walls, attention was beginning to grow. For years, Pelican Bay State Prison operated largely outside public attention. The facility was remote. The inmates were invisible, and the security housing unit remained closed to meaningful outside scrutiny. That began to change in the early 2000s. Attorneys, journalists, and human rights organizations started to document conditions inside the SHU. What they found raised serious legal and ethical questions. Inmates were being held in long-term solitary confinement without clear timelines. Some had not committed violent acts while incarcerated. Others had been validated as gang members based on confidential informants or possession of written material. Civil rights groups argued that isolation on this scale constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Psychologists submitted expert testimony describing the long-term effects of sensory deprivation and social isolation. Federal courts were presented with evidence showing lasting mental harm. Still, the system remained largely unchanged. Then, in 2011, inmates at Pelican Bay took action. Without weapons, without violence, without communication. They began a hunger strike. The strike was organized through carefully coordinated, nonviolent means and spread across California's prison system. At its peak, more than 6,000 inmates in multiple facilities participated. Their demands were specific and documented: an end to indefinite solitary confinement, fair review processes, and improved living conditions inside the SHU. Prison officials initially dismissed the strike, but as weeks passed, public pressure increased. Media coverage expanded. Medical professionals raised concerns. Lawmakers requested explanations. A second hunger strike followed later that year. Then a third, larger one in 2013, involving over 30,000 inmates statewide. These actions forced the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to respond. Policy changes were introduced. The state revised its gang validation process. Indefinite SHU placement was reduced. Step-down programs were created to allow inmates to transition out of isolation. Thousands of prisoners were eventually released from long-term solitary confinement. But Pelican Bay remained operational, and the yard, the symbol of absolute control, still existed. Supporters of the system argued that these measures had prevented violence and saved lives. Critics argued that the damage had already been done. The debate was no longer confined to prison walls. It had become a national conversation, and the question remained unresolved. Pelican Bay State Prison still stands today. The concrete walls remain, the remote location remains, and the yard that once defined absolute control has not disappeared. What has changed is the way the world looks at it. What began as a solution to prison violence became one of the most closely examined examples of long-term isolation in modern American history. For prison officials, Pelican Bay represented order, a system designed to stop bloodshed before it could begin. For critics, it became a warning, a reminder that control, when taken to its extreme, carries consequences that cannot always be reversed. Courts did not declare the prison illegal. The system was not dismantled. Instead, policies were adjusted, limits were introduced, and oversight increased. But for the men who spent decades alone in those concrete yards, the impact did not end when the doors finally opened. Many struggled to reintegrate. Some described isolation as more damaging than physical punishment. Their experiences raised a question that remains unresolved. How much control is necessary to ensure safety? And at what point does security cross into harm? Pelican Bay does not offer a simple answer. It stands as a reminder that the justice system is not only measured by how it punishes, but by how it defines humanity under pressure. And this is only one story. Across the United States and around the world, there are other cases, other systems, and other decisions that continue to shape lives behind closed doors. If you want to explore more real, documented cases like this one, stories rooted in facts, not fiction, you can find them here on this channel. Thank you for watching. And if you want to stay with us as we examine more true cases, prison systems, and real-world investigations, consider subscribing. Because the next story may be closer than you think.